more than 100 unique styles of beer, each with their own set of ingredients, process, guidelines, history, and experience. If you're a beer lover, an industry leader, or somewhere in between, a better knowledge of beer style will improve your life and your work.
Welcome to A Sense of Beer Style, essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. I'm Julia Herz.
And I'm Jeremy Storton.
We're advanced Cicerones, beer judges, home brewers, and we're excited to guide you through the vast and wonderful world of beer styles.
Welcome, everyone. Sense of Beer Style, moving through some big changes in my studio today that will only continue to improve and entice. And hello, Jeremy. Love seeing that smile. And wow, we're here to talk about Gueuze. I mean, come on. Like, we better make this show special. You hopefully better have one in your hand, or two or several. And if not, go to your cellar, go to your local better beer provider, go to your local brewery and get one. And this is a style that has, I think, inspired so much of what goes on in beer, because it's a great example of the simplicity of using the environment, your terroir. It's a great example of blending, right? It's a great example of age. It's also a great example of wild yeast, that, Brettanomyces. And it's a great example of flavor. These are incredible food beers, I would say. Mm-hmm. And so and they're often very sessionable, not heavy, not big, certainly less impactful than many wines. And I've got two next to me, Jeremy. So while you take us through ingredients and history, and please do it, obviously, as you always do, with intention, I'm going to try to make sure the camera's showcasing some of this, because I've got two very different examples. I've got one that's an American craft brewer example, and then I've definitely got one from the original style traditional classic brewery from Belgium that's given us the cork caged, blended, punt on the bottom. So I'm very excited. So I will work in the background while you work in the foreground.
Great. Well, let's start with ingredients. And one of the main ingredients in this beer really is terroir. And we're used to hearing the word terroir when it comes to wine, but there is a terroir when it comes to cheese. There's a terroir when it comes to chocolate. There's a terroir when it comes to beer that we can't always taste because we don't the environment doesn't have as direct an influence over the grains, because we have direct influence over the grains. But terroir comes into play specifically, or especially, I should say, with hops. But most importantly, it comes into play with the yeast in the fermentation. And so when we say the word terroir in respect to beer, we're really, the first beers on my mind are lambic and by extension, Gueuze. So the ingredient list, before I get even more poetic with this stuff, this is the same ingredient list as a lambic. A Gueuze is a lambic. It's a blended lambic. So make sure, if you're listening to this episode, Gueuze, make sure you go back and listen to lambic as well, because there is absolute crossover here. But we're looking at 30 to 40% unmalted wheat, not malted wheat, unmalted wheat, as well as some Pilsner malt. A lot of that has to do with setting up your turbid mash. I'm not going to go into detail on the turbid mash. I spent some time talking about that on the lambic episode. Go listen to that. But the gist of the turbid mash is we need a food supply for all sorts of critters throughout the aging and the full fermentation of this beer, which is going to take up to a year or more, And so we need a different food supply for different stages. It's almost like you need a different gear to get up at different phases of that hill. So that's why we have the unmalted wheat and we have the Pilsner malt and all that stuff to go into it. When we start talking about hops, we're talking about aged hops for these beers, not because we love the smell and flavor of sweaty socks from my teenage son. That's not what we're trying to get. And that's why we typically in other beer styles avoid old hops and with yellow coloring and in them and the isovaleric acid. We don't want that. But they're using aged hops for these that are properly aged, and they're used for as a preservative. Remember, hops are a preservative for beer as well. So they're using that as a preservative, but we're not getting hop flavor. We're not getting hop bitterness out of these. And so they're using aged hops for this purpose. When we talk about yeast for these beers, for lambic beers, these are spontaneously fermented. That means they brew their wort with their turbid mash technique. They put it into a huge, shallow pan the size of a small room to cool off overnight. They open up all the louvers in their windows and they walk away. And they come back the next morning. And once you know it, the beer is starting to bubble. That's because it's spontaneously fermented by all the yeast and bacteria that's in the air, and that's where the terroir comes from. We're looking at Saccharomyces, Brettanomyces yeast. We're looking at Pediococcus, Lactobacillus, and other with the bacteria. Now, the other thing about the difference between lambic and Gueuze is a blend of 1, 2, and 3-year-old lambic, and we'll talk about more of the differences of what makes these two beers a little bit different. But that's the ingredient list. That's the process list. Let's get into what the beer looks like, especially since you have them in front of you.
Yeah, well done, Jeremy. So poetic. And I am showing two very different breweries' approaches.
Yeah.
The one on the right that's a little more clear, that actually is only 5.5% alcohol, and this one's 7%, the one from Belgium, and it's not clear. It also has very little color of foam. So different appearance is important to allow for. When you're studying style guidelines, you want to know what the style guidelines expect, but you also want to allow for within that spectrum the differences. So appearance, traditionally, you're both going to see these as gold in color. That is very common. So 5, give or take, SRM. It's supposed to have excellent clarity. I'm not a stickler about that. I love the fact that when things, beers don't showcase as so clear, it means probably there's more flavor, there's a little more mouthfeel. And the collar of foam is also very important and insisted upon in the style guidelines. Thick, rocky, mousse-like, that seems to last forever. Well, frankly, neither of them have that. But the effervescence is showcasing in both. You've got little nucleation sites on the bottom of these beautiful purpose brewing glassware from Peter Brewcart. And so you've got some effervescence coming from the bottom of the glass and going up. And that basically covers appearance. Either way, though, very inviting and absolutely makes you want to, once you see it, go ahead and smell it.
Well, and before I jump into aroma, you said something that I feel like we ought to address, because yes, it is expected that these beers are very, very, very clear. But let's be real and honest. Your bottle had a cork and a cage on it. There's likely some yeast in the bottom. So it really depends that if someone came along and turned that bottle on its side while it was being stored, well, you're going to lose that clarity as soon as you pick it up right. If you were a little bit aggressive pouring that around in everyone's glass, the last person in that row is likely going to get a lot more sediment, and the first person, the last person's glass are going to look different for that reason. And so it really has to do with you, the pourer, the opener, the drinker, the bottle storer. The clarity literally is in your hands on this one. Fair?
Very fair, very well described, because if you're tableside getting it served to you, there is a different experience based on which portion of the bottle your beverage came from.
Yeah, absolutely. But now let's get into aroma. Now, this is one of those fun beers. There's a lot of words that we use to describe this, the Gueuze and lambic, and these are words that when you say them out loud, it sounds awful, and when you actually taste them, it sounds wonderful. And I always get a kick out of that, especially when I'm teaching a class and trying to describe this. I recently taught a class and had people love the flavor of it, but when I described it out loud, they're just like, "Oh dear God, no." When we're talking about that, I always start with malt. The malt is very in the background for this. This is a strongly fermentation forward beer, but the malt provides that backbone. You have this light, bready, grainy, can be kind of honey. It's likely going to be wheat-like. You're going to have that wheat flavor coming through. It's very kind of lemony and like wet pizza dough like is usually how it manifests. And you're going to get this impression of sourness. No, you cannot smell sourness, but you're going to smell all these compounds that take your brain to Sour Town. So just keep that in mind. But also what you're smelling is going to be really, really complex. It's going to be maybe overwhelming, but in a good way, where you're not even sure where to start. And a lot of that has to do with that perception of sweetness, that perception of sourness, that perception of bready, grainy like notes. But then all of a sudden comes that fermentation profile. This is where and everyone's going to describe this differently depending on their life experience. I've heard people describe this as like the inner city of a downtown after a rain. I've heard people describe this as going to a rodeo. Terms that are common for this style are barnyard, sweaty horse, wet goat, goat blanket. Um, and when I say rodeo, we are talking about words like indole and enteric, which really references poop. I'm sorry, I just got to say it. But when you go to a rodeo, when you go to an inner city downtown after a rain, you're going to get a complex smell that's earthy, funky, pungent, sweet, and that's everything in there. Lastly, with this beer style, we are also going to get some sour fruit flavors, and we're talking citrus, lemon, grapefruit, plum like apples, rhubarb. You can get some honey. It kind of depends. If these are specifically oak aged, you might get some oak. It could be really low. Typically, these are aged in neutral barrels, meaning barrels that have been used before, so you're not getting a strong oaky flavor out of them. Um, but if you do get any of those enteric, kind of more pungent aromas, they should be very low, if any at all. The BJCP also says that you shouldn't expect any smokiness or cigar-like aromas. I don't expect smoke. I've never had smoke in these. I disagree somewhat. Some of these beers, I've gotten just a little bit of aroma and subsequently flavor of like walking into a really good cigar humidor. I love that. I look forward to that. So I'm going to agree to disagree on this one. But because of those hops, we're not looking for any cheesy or funky BO flavors either, or aromas either. So keep that in mind. But that's enough. That's enough on aroma. I'm going to pass it to you for flavor.
Great. And I've been exercising discipline while you've been sharing aroma so I could taste when I get to describe flavor. And yet, while I'm setting up, getting ready, I will say I'm getting notes of, say, Play-Doh, right?
Oh, good one. Yeah.
A little bit of advanced, certainly Brettanomyces, not displaying in that tropical vein. There's 10 plus strands of Brett. You never know which one Mother Nature introduced into the lambic or blended Gueuze for sure. But that it is so complex, and yet delicacy is also indicated. So go ahead and tasting. And the style guidelines talk about sour and funky on the palate. Man, does that have both. And sour is a sense of acidity, but more, right? Sour can be a snap of tart, or it can be really acidic and mouth-wateringly sour, pungent. I'm going to say this is so balanced. And what a great first sip of the day for a beer at 3:00 in the afternoon with you all and Jeremy. And what lingers to me is the showcase of what beers from Belgium, if you're doing styles in the Belgian vein, what these beers showcase most is the yeast, right? Your yeast is what makes Belgian beers so famous. English is famous for the malt. American beer is often famous for the hops. We're talking about the wild yeast here in the pecking order of Saccharomyces and Brettanomyces and probably Lactobacillus in this beverage. So sour and funky on the palate. And then, you do get a sense of that malt, right? Jeremy talked about Pilsner malt, malted wheat. That's a delicate style of fermentable, both of those, and it is in the background. So I would say almost a little bit of I don't want to call it sourdough bread, but bread-esque in the background. And bitterness is not there. There's no bitterness. Style guidelines for a Gueuze would call for low to none, so that's appropriate. Mm-hmm. And it's the sourness that really provides most of the balance. There's no hop flavor. That's not what this beer is about. Style guidelines will emphasize that. And then that crisp, dry finish, and that aftertaste of flavor and then the mouthfeel that leaves you lip smacking and wanting another sip. This is very refreshing. And the version that I'm tasting here, we'll talk about commercial examples, and I'll share this when we get to that. This is 7% alcohol, and boy, does it not taste like that. And then you get an essence. You could, in the style guidelines, get oak, vanilla. I'm definitely getting honey from both of these. And that's such a sweet, wonderful indication of flavor without the residual sugar. That's honey can be that way without the residual sugar. So it talks about style guidelines should not be one-dimensionally sour. Neither of these are. They are so layered. And my second one's 5.5% alcohol. And that's incredible to be this layered at 5.5% alcohol. But fruity, funky, and that's simplifying things is really what this beer is about, and an essence of age. It's interesting, the one beer that I tried first from Belgium, it says best before 2031. So, wow,
Yeah.
you kind of can age these.
Yeah. Yeah. You can kind of age them for a while. And that's what I love. When we talk about meat being gamey or cheese being funky, this is the gamey, funky part of beer, and in the best way possible. When we talk about mouthfeel, I feel like if we're talking about mouthfeel for beers like this, obviously, Juliet, you just mentioned here we are in 2024, and these are meant to drink before 2031, and that was probably, I'm guessing that was bottled, not this year. So we're looking at quite a long range of being able to hold on to these things. When you open a bottle, especially Lambic and Gueuze, it's a snapshot in time. And so when we talk about mouthfeel, I mean, like, well, I need more information. Is it young? Is it aged? Is it old? Where are we with this? So just understand that as it's young and early bottled, it's going to have more body. And if you let it go all the way to 2031 and you're in 2024, it's going to be lighter in body because all of those organisms are still at work inside the bottle. That's why the bottle is so thick. That's why there's a cork and cage on it, because that pressure builds up. Just like a champagne bottle, it is still working and activating. It's still alive and very well. So when we talk about body, I need more information before we call it something. The acidity of it is going to be it could be low to high. Again, it's a snapshot in time. It's all going to change. The older it gets, everything's going to mellow out and just kind of find harmony with each other. And so it depends on when we're finding it. So the younger it is, the little bit more assertive both the carbonate. Well, actually, I take that back. The acidity is going to be. When we're talking carbonation, these beers tend to be very, very, very high in carbonation. We talk about it in volumes of CO2. And if you take a glass and fill it with carbon dioxide, that's 1 volume of CO2. If you pressurize it and put twice as much CO2 in that glass, then that's 2 volumes. A Gueuze can be up to like 4 volumes of CO2. It's just like champagne, highly, highly carbonated and wonderful. What a great way to start off dinner. Let's talk about astringency, though. We don't have dark grains. We don't have a lot of hops. If it does go into barrels, it's usually neutral barrels. So we're not really looking at a lot of astringency here. It should be light. It should be refreshing. It should be carbonated. It should invite another sip. And so that's what we're looking for. But describing a mouthfeel, there's a huge range, but for those reasons. So just be advised. Let's talk about the different style comparisons. This one should be pretty straightforward.
It is pretty straightforward, and you have to kind of put your head in the game that a Gueuze is a blended and aged version of a lambic. So that's your baseline style to test it against. Much more carbonated, it should be at least. And that complexity, that developed complexity, that more nuanced and layered and deep acidity, as opposed to maybe being more sour, it's just deeper, more complex, more inviting, and more refined. And then the wild character, that Brettanomyces, will develop more. And with age, Brettanomyces can definitely go through all sorts of cycles of flavor. So look for in a Gueuze compared to a lambic, much more development in the Brett, the carbonation, the sourness, but otherwise they're just a blended version of a lambic.
Yeah. All right. So classic examples of this. Obviously, Gueuze and lambic originates from the Seine Valley in Belgium, but a lot of producers have taken that inspiration and brought it to the U.S. and other parts of the world. So you can find a lambic style or a Gueuze style beer. In fact, you're probably more likely to find a Gueuze style beer than a lambic. That doesn't necessarily come from Belgium. So if you find a Spawn beer, SPON, at some modern craft brewery, good chances that's going to be Gueuze like. So look for that. The classics, and Julia's got some. The Boon Old Gueuze, Cantillon is one of the main ones that we always think about. Cantillon Classic Gueuze, the Girardin Gueuze, 1882. Mort Subide, we know that for their Creek beer, but they also have a Gueuze. Hansen's Old Gueuze, Tre Fontinen, luckily has become a little bit more prolific, at least where I'm looking for beer, so it's easier to find. And of course, we all know Lindemans. They're a lambic brewery. We've seen their fruit lambics, but they also make a Gueuze Cuvée René. So go out there, find your Gueuze, find your Spawn beers, and give this a try. It's wonderful. But let's talk some numbers.
So numbers in your beer studies are important, and in your beer appreciation, so you can dial in and notice what is there based on what is what the brewer's intending to, if they're indicating a specific style. So original gravity is nothing dramatic or to write home about. 1040 to 1054. That's going to take us to a final gravity, believe it or not, of 1000, which virtually in the beer world means no residual sugar, to 1006, which is still relatively dry. I think anything under 10008 is relatively dry. And the ABV is 5 to 8%. That's a broad range. My one example on the right is 5.5% from Arizona, an amazing collaboration beer. My example from Belgium, 7%. So that is within the 5 to 8% ABV range for the Gueuze. And then international bitterness units, if we're saying there should be no hop flavor and bitterness, virtually low or none, 0 to 10, right? 10 is barely perceptible levels. And then standard reference method is 5 to 6. Just like I mentioned, just remember the color gold is 5 and SRM range, or tick 1 up to 6 when it's a darker, deeper, richer gold. And there are your general vitals.
Yeah, and for those of you who speak beer outside the U.S., the EBC or European Brewery Convention, again, numbers are doubled, so we're looking at 10 to 12 for those same colors. For original Plato, we're looking at 10 to 13.5. Final Plato, 0 to 1.5. And if you're looking at your alcohol content through the lens of Plato, we're looking about 10 to 12. For those of you who speak the lingo. So glass type and temperature. These beers, lambics and Gueuze, are very first close kissing cousins of each other because the Gueuze is made from different ages of lambic, and so they typically are served in the same glass. And if you think about that water glass that's probably in your mom's or your grandma's cabinet, where you have like 5 different flat sides, that's the French jelly glass. A lambic glass is very much like that, but typically instead of those flat sides, you have these these angles kind of going up toward the top of the glass to kind of give a little bit more dimension. Otherwise, it looks like a fancy water glass, and that is, think of something like this on a hot day when you need to take your beret off and sit down and just kind of take a load off for a second. These are wonderful beers to have in these glasses. I want these to be a little bit on the colder side. If we're in Fahrenheit country, I want these anywhere from 40 to 44 degrees on the chilled side, because of all this funkiness and Brett character and all this stuff. As these warms up, that just gets more and more expressed, and there's a diminishing return on that from my experience. So 40 to 44, or if you're in Celsius, I think we're talking like 5 to 6. Thereabouts. If these are served in a bottle, I'm typically looking for someone to have one of those lambic baskets to hold that bottle on its kind of at an angle upward, but on its side, so that we can make a silent pour. to make sure that every glass is clear and wonderful and delicious. But pairing suggestions. Let's talk about what food we would go with this.
Right on. Home run. Great way to end a show like this because these are such food
Yeah.
beers. In being so delicate and yet standing out on its own for flavor and memory, right? Any, I think, Gueuze that you'd ever drink, you'll remember each Gueuze that you drink. The classics, if you ever have been influenced by the amazing Garrett Oliver of Brooklyn Brewing Company, The Brewmaster's Table, highly recommend that book. And he's really one that I think showcased to the world not just classic beer styles from different regions of the world, but the foods that are meant to go with them. So mussels and frites with
Hmm.
a Gueuze and a lambic is a classic in Belgium. If you're touring in Belgium, you will see it on a menu and get offered it. And I think there's a sense of almost gaminess to fish and shellfish, right? And the Gueuze has that gaminess too. So I think that wild nature of sour kind of Brettanomyces, British fungus type of yeast is really going to go and showcase well. Plus the Pilsner malt and the wheat malt almost act as a bread against that mussel dish or the shellfish that you choose to have with it, or maybe a white fish and a beurre blanc sauce if you go to France or in your own kitchen. So those are my two out of the gate ones. And then the more advanced the cheese could be, the better. But these beers are delicate, so you don't want to get too pungent, too stinky. Although they will match very well in flavor intensity, they could get barreled over if you go too intense of a cheese.
I think all of that is just perfect and wonderful. And while you were describing that, I just kind of envisioned having a beer like this. Again, I imagine being in Belgium. I've got this in the great glass, perfect temperature. I've got my beret on because I'm bald and I'm probably a little bit chilled. And I probably picked up a beret because I'm traveling and I want to be like the locals. But you have these beautiful scallops. And I love diver scallops, but just they're sweet, they're buttery, they're briny. I need something highly effervescent, clean, sour, and gamey and funky to kind of provide an extra element, an extra dimension. I think that would be beautiful. Same thing with lobster. That'd be fantastic. I think this would be even wonderful with more like the steaky type of fish. The predator fish like swordfish or thresher shark would be amazing with a little bit more savory character in those meats to bring this out. And then lastly, I just think about how about especially for those folks who don't want to eat meat at all? How about a pasta with a cream sauce with some wild mushrooms and some goat cheese in
Yes.
there, just to pull that gamey, earthy flavors out? Oh, that would just be beautiful.
Yes, yes, and yes. Yes, yes, and yes. So go get some of these beers, listen to the show again, tell us what you think, pair them, enjoy them, and these beers are what life is all about, for sure.
Absolutely. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to A Sense of Beer Style, the essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. With advanced Cicerones, me, Julia,
And me, Jeremy.
tune into the next episode as we continue exploring the world of beer styles and what to make of them. We encourage you to listen to the prepisodes to build your foundation and better understand beer styles.
And before the next episode, I'd like to ask you to review the show and let us know what you'd like featured in upcoming episodes. Until next time, here's to you and your sense of beer style. Thank you for listening. Cheers.